So the title of my talk is Science into Practice, Bridging the Gap. And really, in a way, you're going to listen to my musings. It's interesting, I stepped back a little bit from this subject area. I've been in Australia for the last 8 years building a vet school out in South Australia. And it's interesting to come back in a year ago and just see how things have changed or haven't changed since that book was published. I think this is an extremely challenging area. Everybody recognises the importance of it. But I just want to highlight one or two things. They're very personal things that I'm going to talk about today, just to make people think in slightly different directions. So bear with me, all will become clear as we go through. I need to declare an interest. I am Editor-in-Chief of the Veterinary Education Journal. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but in reality, I'm going to focus about some of what I consider to be important topics in the evidence-based veterinary medicine space. So the title, The Science into Practice, Bridging the Gap, if you think about what the bridge is, the bridge to a large extent is the process of evidence-based veterinary medicine. And I'm interested today in looking in the resources that kind of underpin it. So I've thrown up an abstract, which you can see. It's a bit wordy, but I'm going to talk about one or two selected topics in evidence-based practice. I'm interested in knowledge mobilisation, and I'm interested in what evidence-based medicine can do in that informing research space. And we've got some learning objectives for you. I want to focus a little bit on some of the challenges, and I want to focus a little bit why evidence-based medicine fits into that science into practice space. With new technologies, and particularly with things like Vet Compass, I just want to touch on what we're beginning to call practice-based evidence. And I want to focus a little bit on where our CVS Knowledge and Veterinary Evidence are making some really good attempts to close the gap, if you like, to increase the speed at which science is adopted into practice. I think it's salutary to look back a little bit. This is a quote from Keane, we use it in the book, and it says, progress in the field of evidence-based veterinary medicine will become a benchmark of our professional progress in the 21st century. I think it's a little strong in retrospect. I think it's one of. I think professionalism, professional skills is also a massive step forward in terms of what the profession is trying to do. But nevertheless, it's entered the vocabulary evidence-based veterinary medicine, and it is very important. And just to remind people what it's all about, this is me musing back to my Cambridge days, but this is in the early days where thermographs cost about 40,000 quid. And this is me borrowing it from our equine colleagues and saying, well, what happens if you put a thermograph onto a cow that's got a septic arthritis? And of course, you can see it and can pick it up. And this got published in the Vet Record. But of course, N equals 1. You know, is that strong evidence? Is it weak evidence? Has it got a poor value of evidence? And then there's things like student projects. This got published again in the Vet Record. Quantitative data tells you a little bit about the sensitivities and specificities of a sheep that's collapsed late in pregnancy. Fairly small numbers. You know, what does that add to the evidence? You know, how much credibility do you put on it? Does it change the way you look at those collapsed sheep in a pregnant flock, late stage? So I'm just kind of throwing that in there. I've always enjoyed this quote. It doesn't appear in the book. But our 20th century, this is Malcolm Muggeridge, the late Malcolm Muggeridge, of course, 20th century, far from being notable for scientific scepticism, is one of the most credulous eras in all history. It is not that people believe in nothing, which is bad enough, but they believe in anything, which is really terrible. And that's one of the challenges for us in a way. People have various beliefs, you know, whether it be homeopathy or whatever. And he's just challenging us. He's saying, watch out. You know, we think we are a science-based world. In reality, maybe that's not quite as true as we think. This is something that we tend to forget, and it's an interesting topic. And it's interesting, one of the early books that I bought was a book called Evidence-Based Medicine. And their first chapter was about the natural history of disease. And it makes the case that most diseases follow a pattern. It makes the case if that pattern of disease is predictable, then new treatments can be evaluated by observing the effect. In other words, it's challenging a little bit about this obsession with science and saying if you've got predictability, do you actually need to do controls? The problem in disease, of course, is natural history of most of our diseases is too variable to measure the impact of treatment without doing controls. And the other thing, of course, in evidence-based medicine, and this evidence-based medicine makes this point very clearly, that clinical experience can be misled if patients recover in spite of treatment. So we know to a certain extent a proportion of our patients, in fact, do that, so we can get misled. This is a classic slide. It's one I've used for many years, and it's just making the case, look, there's a wide range of clinical tasks that we do in this diagnostic space, in this professional space, interpreting diagnostic tests, making diagnosis, treating, selecting treatments, prevention and control strategies, prognosis, cost of intervention. And it's just making the point that clinicians need to know whether these procedures and judgments are valid or not. And of course, we turn to science to really deliver that validity. It's also worth pointing out that evidence-based veterinary medicine, or science into practice, is all about practitioners identifying information needs. And one of the dangers is that when we're in practice is that we forget to ask questions. So we've got information that's needed and known, so that's fine, we get that. And then we've got information that's needed but not known, and that's great, we've identified it. And of course, the worst type is information needs that are not recognised. And what, as a profession, our reflective learning, if you like, is really saying, look, watch out for these information needs that you haven't recognised. You need to reflect and decide whether there's something that you really, really need to know that might shape different outcomes for patients. Evidence-based veterinary medicine, what is it? Few definitions around. The Sackett one is the one that's often quoted, and I understand that one completely. It's combining clinical expertise, patient values, and evidence. We narrowed our definition a little bit to make it more about the science of evidence. So we called it the use of current best evidence in making clinical decisions. But I wouldn't either is I'm comfortable with. And of course, the buzzwords are around just-in-time learning or just-in-case learning, and of course, the one I'm using today, which is science into practice. So again, this is quite a historical slide, but I think it makes the point: application of evidence-based veterinary medicine can improve and optimise all those different things we've talked about. I think providing informed choices is really quite critical. I think it enables us to defend our decisions scientifically, which is helpful. And of course, it can serve to be a patient-oriented, lifelong, self-directed learning process, isn't it? The bottom one is often overlooked, and it's something that I feel particularly strongly about, which is identifying information deficits in literature and directing clinical research. And one of the pushbacks I sometimes get when people are doing these sort of mini knowledge summaries is that we couldn't find any papers, and authors think they've failed. In actual fact, they haven't failed. It's a really critical outcome. And what we need to be clear as a profession is how we garner those deficits and how we can lobby for research funds to be directed to correct that deficit. Just hammering home again, informed decision-making. It is all about decision-making. It is about improving patient care. We sometimes lose sight and get obsessed by the process, but ultimately that is what we're trying to deliver, is informed choices for owners and a better quality and a higher level of care for our patients. This is the Royal College, and this particular paper is quite well buried in their website, and it's something that I decided that I'd draw people's attention to. This is a position paper that was written by Jorg and Pfeiffers in 2012. And let's see what it says. Royal College Setting Veterinary Standards. Let's see what it says. We get the 5 steps of evidence-based medicine, the 3 A's. So it's ask a clinical question, acquire the best evidence, appraise the evidence, apply the evidence, and assess the performance. That is now well embedded. There's no need for me to spend time on that. But this is what the Royal College assessed. First thing is evidence-based medicine expectations. So here we go. It says the Royal College expects veterinary surgeons and veterinary nurses to make clinical decisions according to their professional judgment. We all get that. Based on the best available evidence at the time and what is right for the individual owners. So they're making really strong statements about what we should be doing. And then, of course, they acknowledge the challenge, saying there are many papers that are published in a year. This is from 2010. They talk about 18,000. That today would be much higher, probably 25 or 30,000. And how on earth do you and I keep up to speed and do evidence-based veterinary medicine and go through the process in a very busy practice, and therein lies one of the challenges. So they accept the challenge, but then they say, well, nevertheless, you should still be doing it. And it's this kind of forked tongue approach, isn't it? And we get it, and then bridging the gap, this is the critical one, which I'm really focusing on today, which is there is currently not little knowledge, a large time gap between the discovery of new knowledge and its acceptance and adoption to routine practice. Any efforts to shorten the gap will undoubtedly result in better clinical care. So that's the bridging of the gap. That's the gap that I'm interested in. And of course, what are the outcomes of it? Well, it should lead to better clinical decisions, saving lives, better health care, and so on and so forth. And then it talks about governance. It says it should really be embedded in part of your governance. We know the practice standards at level 2 and level 3 do embrace it, but they're linking it to governance. They're saying everybody should be aware of the principles, so they're hammering away at the education side of it. And they're also making the point that at undergraduate level, we should be making really strong links between teaching science and also this process called evidence-based veterinary medicine. So I think that statement document's quite interesting. They're pushing hard. They've recognised the importance of it. And then, of course, resources. You know, resources have been around for a long time in the medical field. There are several books, lots of publications in the veterinary world now. And of course, Royal Veterinary Knowledge has made massive strides towards filling this education gap. They provide training, workshops, networking, conferences, toolkits. They've developed this open access journal, Vetri Evidence, which is free to publish, and so on and so forth. And now they've brought on stream In Focus, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So there's a massive step forward in what RCVS Knowledge is doing in the evidence-based medicine space. I want to acknowledge the Evidence-Based Veterinary Medicine Centre in Nottingham. They're also doing some good work. They do research, they do the sort of knowledge summaries, they do the meta-analysis archive. So there's a big springboard there. And then in America, we've got Evidence-Based Veterinary Medicine Association, which has been active since 2004 and has an annual conference and quite a good website and lots of information. So that's kind of just bringing people up to speed and saying what resources have been developed, you know, what is it, what statements are being made by the profession. One question that always irks me is this word evidence, and it's misused and abused enormously. And I think we have to be really careful about what we understand by evidence. So I've thrown in this slide, it's called BSE, and it's all about mad cow disease, which was a major problem both economically and as a zoonotic, and it started in 88, or was picked up in 88 and then tailed off. You can see my graph. And what I want to do is just show you quite a poor quality video, and I apologise for that. But this is a video of Gummer, who was the Minister of Agriculture in 1995 or 94, making statements about mad cow disease. So I'm just going to let this run for a minute.
The Agriculture Minister, John Gummer, today enrolled his daughter Cordelia in his campaign to persuade people that eating beef is safe. It was a little hot for her. But later he munched it himself to prove to the world that he at least is confident there's nothing to worry about.
When you've got the clear support of the scientists who deal with these matters, clear support of the Department of Health, the clear action of the government, there is no need for people to be worried, and I can say perfectly honestly that I shall go on eating beef this time. Children will go on eating beef because there is no need to be worried. Now, you can't do anything more than that.
In another effort to calm people's fears, Mr. Gummer's ministry will next week publish a pamphlet outlining what is known about BSE and answering some of the key questions. Today, the government's chief medical officer lent his support to official efforts to restore confidence in beef.
There is no risk associated with eating British beef, and that everyone, children, adults, patients in hospital, can be quite confident that it's safe to eat.
This latest panic is back.
Okay, so I've been provocative by showing that, and the use of the word evidence was really quite misleading. And I think it's important that we spend just a little bit of time talking about evidence. And so I've got a slide in front of you, or in front of me. And the top one is evidence definition by the Oxford Dictionary. English dictionary, and it says the available, what's the definition? The available body of facts or information indicating whether a belief or proposition is true or valid. And it's actually quite difficult to tease that apart. So I've put another definition, which is about scientific evidence. And it says scientific evidence support or counter a scientific theory or hypothesis based upon experimentation or observation and interpretation in accordance with scientific method. So again, you kind of think, yeah, okay, I kind of understand what that means, I think. And I think you do have to think really carefully about both those definitions. So if we think of evidence, we often think of evidence being strong evidence or weak evidence. And the strength of that evidence is actually based on really two things: the validity of the scientific methods that were used, and something called the power of the experiment, which is based on how much variance or background noise there is within the parameter you're measuring, and the sample size that you've used. And I want you to consider the last three lines, actually. So I've said consider. There is strong evidence that BSE or mad cow disease is or is not a zoonotic. There is weak evidence that BSE is or is not a zoonotic. And there is no evidence that BSE is or is not a zoonotic. Now, you've got to think about what does that actually mean? So there is strong evidence that BSE is not a zoonotic. So what does that actually mean? Well, it means there's been a variety of different experiments of high quality that have got high power, and none of those experiments have been able to demonstrate that BSE is a zoonotic. And that's what we mean. But equally, we could have strong evidence that BSE is a zoonotic if we'd have had powerful experiments with high power, with valid scientific methods, and they'd been unable to, or they had been able to demonstrate that BSE was a zoonotic. So you have to be incredibly careful about what evidence means. Evidence is about the validity and the power of the experiment. It's not about the finding. The finding needs to be defined separately. Same with weak evidence. What does weak evidence mean? It means there's been poor quality or very little or studies done to prove a hypothesis one way or the other. And when there is no evidence, it simply means the experimentation has not been done. So you just have to be really, really careful about understanding what evidence means, because it's related to a particular hypothesis or a theory. If you say strong evidence, it only tells you about the validity and the power of the experiment, not the finding directly. So there's the summary. Evidence is something that serves as proof. The value of proof may range from weak to strong, I've always indicated. And this is critical. Studies which do not use established scientific methodologies will produce evidence that is invalid. And it's really, really important. And that's why when we're looking at scientific evidence, when we're looking at published papers, we need to understand and appreciate the design and whether it conforms to accepted norms and principles. Now, what do you do if there's no evidence? And this is a real sort of political call in a way. This is a very difficult one. And if you think the risk could be there, then we talk about this thing called a precautionary principle. And you might want to reflect what the precautionary principle may have looked like back in 1994. We'd have lost all beef exports and so on and so forth if we'd have taken the precautionary principle. So politicians are trapped in a difficult space, but I want you to be aware of no evidence. How do you deal with it? And it is very difficult. And precautionary principle might come at a cost. I'm not really going to spend a long time looking at the process, but there are a few things that I think is worth at least reflecting on. I've already said this already. Are the scientific methods valid? If you're looking at some information, whether it be from InFocus, from one paper, or whether it be from a collection of papers, are the methodologies used valid? Is there a statement about how powerful this study is? Are we aware of the amount of background noise? Are we aware of how the sample size? Have we got a measure of the power of that study? In other words, what difference can it measure if difference exists? And there aren't many papers that actually publish the power of the study. And it's really quite critical, particularly when you get a paper that demonstrates no difference between two interventions. How do you interpret that if you haven't got the power? If you don't know what the measure of the difference is, how can you interpret that outcome? Are confidence intervals provided? And this is kind of the move towards in the literature saying, hang on, statistical difference is all very well, but it doesn't give you any measure of where the true value might lie, or what the true difference might be. So you've got to be careful with statistical difference. That's important. It is important that you've demonstrated a difference or a similarity, but you need to quantify that. And around that quantification, you need some sense of the range of estimate. Where does that estimate live in those confidence intervals? And are the results being expressed in a clinical, meaningful way? You as a clinician, me as a clinician, can we actually interpret the values that we're being presented with? What difference does it make if I treat or change the treatment across another 20 dogs? Do I get, one better outcome? Do I get two better outcomes? What's the measure that enables me to translate that science into something that I can give an owner an informed choice whether we change this treatment or not? The other real bone of contention is this one of generalizability of applicability. And maybe we overthink this, maybe we overtalk generalizability. When we've got a result in a study, and that study's been carried out in a very limited range of animals, perhaps a referral centre, do the outcomes really apply to the population in general? Does it really apply to that individual animal that sat on my table? And we're always told to be really cautious and very careful. And we do, but do we have the luxury in veterinary science to have massive studies and all the rest of it? So in a sense, it's a real judgment call at times as to the applicability of the information provided by some studies. This is just making the point that number needed to treat is really quite a useful measure. This is looking at quite an old study now, but a very big study looking at canine atopic dermatitis, comparing two different treatments, and asking the question, what difference does it make? And in this case, they use this value of number needed to treat, so you get one better outcome if you treat 17 dogs compared to using the other treatment. And it puts it into real context that most of us can understand and appreciate. I've always enjoyed this little slide. It kind of takes you into my world, or takes you into the world of people trying to do systematic surveys or systematic studies, or even doing best bets, or even doing knowledge summaries. And it's trying to say, well, the initial level of confidence in this study or studies, what is it based on? And of course, depending on the design, dictates how powerful that experiment is. So that's your first starting point, isn't it? And then in the middle, which is considering lowering or raising the level of confidence, is all about, well, is the bias? Is there inconsistency? Is the design slightly imperfect? Is there some bias attached to what I'm reading? So you can higher or lower that confidence. And then, of course, the last column is saying, well, the final level of confidence, what do we attach? I've looked at the literature, I've found these studies, I'm going to attach some kind of rating to it. And of course, there's high, moderate, low, and very low. And you kind of think, yeah, okay, can I remember what he said about evidence 5 slides back? So this is what their definition is. It's taken from this American side. So if we look at the grading value of evidence, if we look at the high, we're saying we're very confident. I like this use of word of confident, actually. We are very confident that the true effect lies close to the estimate or the found estimate of the effect, or the estimate that's published in the paper. And I can kind of understand that. That tells me something. There's truth. It's this search for truth, isn't it? And then if we go to the sort of low, let's have a look at that. Our confidence in the effect estimate is limited. The true effect may be substantially different from the estimate of the effect. And I kind of get that. And I really do like this sort of grading system, because it begins to integrate, it begins to sort of give me that cozy feeling that I actually am beginning to understand the sort of confidence and the weight and behind this, whether intervention will work or whether it won't change things. This is me just throwing in an example, really, of power and caution behind power. So this is a study that Mark and I did really early on. And we thought, you know, if you want to look at evidence-based veterinary medicine, what would be a good thing to have a go at? So we had a go at this commercially available homeopathic nosode. I apologise for people who are deep into homeopathic. It was advertised as a homeopathic product, but you could argue that it isn't because it's not being delivered by a homeopath. But it was a controlled, randomised design, double-blinded, you know, all the right noises to say, wow, this is a highly valid experiment. This must be producing really strong evidence. And you kind of think, yeah, this is going to be okay. And of course, the results are shown in the bottom right-hand corner. So what this nosode did, and we spent many happy morning on winter mornings going down to a farm, 4 in the morning. And what you used to do, you've got this liquid and you're supposed to spray it on the vulvae of cows. So we had step ladders going up from the milking parlour and we parted the vulvae and sprayed this on the vaginal mucosa. And I think we did about 100 or 200 cows, I can't remember now. And we did that, I think, 3 days running. And then the claim of this nosode, that whatever the problem, it would reduce the somatic cell count. So in cows, when you get infection of the udder, you get an increase in somatic cell counts. Farmers get paid on the number of, or the concentration of somatic cell counts. So if you can bring them down, it's of high value to the farmer. And this nosode was claimed that it could do that. And so we thought, well, okay, we'll have a look at this. And there it is, there's the graph. So we're up the side, we've got the somatic cell counts. Along the bottom, we sampled these cows for 30 days. I think it was every 4 or 5 days that we sampled them. And what you can see there is the standard errors in the 2 lines. So we had a control group, which we didn't treat. And then we had a treatment group, which we did treat. And you go, ha, I told you so, homeopathy doesn't work. That is the wrong message. So if you do a power calculation, we've only done a single farm, I think there's 250 cows on that farm. And if you look at the power of this experiment, because there is so much variability with these somatic cell counts anyway in cows, the power of this experiment was with only about sort of a 70% chance of demonstrating a 30% difference in the somatic cell counts. In other words, this was a very weak evidence. In spite of it being randomized control, in spite of it being blinded, it was actually quite weak evidence to ask the question, does this product make a difference? And I'm alerting you to this fact. This is quite critical to understand that experimental design is only part of it. You have to look at the power within that experimental design to truly understand what the outcomes are telling you. Okay, I want to just reflect a little bit. This is a list that I made some years ago to say, making evidence-based medicine a reality, what do we need to do? And I thought it might be interesting just to go through this as a bit of an audit to say, well, you know, a lot of water's gone under the bridge, 10 or 12 years have passed since we wrote the book. How are we travelling? And so the first thing is funding bodies. Is there an increased priority to be, an increased priority needs to be given to veterinary clinical research? I still find it quite difficult to get funding for clinical research. It depends which sector you're working, but certain sectors really battle, the charities do what they can and all the rest of it. But I still think there's a lack of funding in that area to really underpin the evidence base that we need. In terms of research scientists, what do we need them to do? They need to address common and important clinical topics. And I would argue, is there a real mechanism as a profession so that we identify from the ground up, from the bottom up, from practice upwards, what those needs are? And I would question there's a bit of a gap there in terms of being able to register that this is an area that you can't find information on, and yet it's a recurrent problem. It's a recurrent information need that I simply don't have the answer to. We need them to carry out valid experimentation and designs and procedures. A lot of people are drawn into the research space. Many vets are drawn into the research space. It is to be a research scientist, there is a huge toolkit that you need to have. and it's very easy to do poor quality research. So what we need is high quality research in that clinical space. And the results, we need research scientists to express them in a clinically relevant variable or parameter. So how are we travelling across there? I would argue we're not necessarily addressing common and important clinical topics in all sectors. I think editors play an enormous part in enabling us to access studies, enable us to access primary research. And editors are under normal pressure to put up the number of hits or quotes or the ratings. And if you look at negative information, we do know, there have been studies done across this, that negative information gets published less often than studies that produce a difference between two interventions. And so there's a bias. There is an inherent bias in the literature in terms of what gets published. And therein lies one of the problems for us, that we actually need all studies to be published, irrespective of the outcomes of those studies. Now, the industries are doing quite a good job. They are beginning to put a lot more stuff online. I still think editors are under considerable pressure to perhaps publish significant positive findings rather than the negative outcomes. So we need them to produce the information in abstract form so that we can understand it as practitioners. That's improved quite significantly. The formatting of abstracts now is much more geared. They've often got clinical bottom lines. They're often cut into sections so we can understand very quickly the design and what the outcomes were, the methods. So that's, I think, improved quite a lot. The power of a study, I do question how often that is asked for or delivered. And of course, experimental designs, we are reliant upon reviewers and editors to really indicate how good or bad this design is and what the quality of evidence might be. And of course, statistics is always an issue. You're asking reviewers who don't get paid for that role to look at statistics. And we do know, and people have looked at this, that a relatively high proportion of statistical tests that are used are actually not used appropriately. This is an important one, primary and secondary literature databases. In order for you and I to access literature, we really need a one-stop shop in a way. I don't want to have to look at half a dozen databases to find the veterinary literature that I'm searching for to answer a question. User-friendly search functions, yep, they are a bit clunky. Some of the meshing takes a lot of understanding. Online access to full papers, that's increased enormously, and that will continue to increase, so that's a big step forward. Affordable. One of the problems with open access is the cost of people publishing in those journals. Some of them exceed £1,000, often as high as €1,500. So it gets quite expensive for people to publish, even though it's got free access to people who want to use the information. So I think that's a bit of a sticking point. And of course, appropriate indexing of evidence. Have we got a scale that we all agree to about the level of evidence and what it all means? Appropriate labelling of knowledge, that's across all forms of information, whether it be textbooks or primary research. And of course, that education space, in my view, has taken the biggest leap forward. There's massive awareness about evidence-based veterinary medicine, both at postgraduate and undergraduate level. And I think that's the big step up. And in terms of adoption by veterinary surgeons, diligent application of evidence-based veterinary medicine, the stopping point here is that we've got insufficient knowledge summaries, insufficient best bets, insufficient people delivering what the Cochrane Centre does in the medical world. I don't think practitioners have got massive amounts of time to spend doing their own literature searches. And somehow, to bridge the gap, we need to have those done by other people and delivered in a way that is easily accessible and easily searchable. And that's part of my bridging the gap notion by my title. So this is it. This is really what's contributing a lot to bridging the gap. These mini summaries, if you like, or knowledge summaries, of which there are several out there. The medics tend to use CATs and poems. They're all acronyms which mean the same thing. And in the veterinary world, we've got Best Bets from Nottingham, and we've got Vetri Evidence, which is using this term knowledge summaries. And quite simply, they address a single and simple clinical question. And we do a brief look at the literature, and we apply some principles, and we try and tease out what evidence it's providing to us across that particular question. And this is an example. This is an old example. I think Mark Holmes put this together some time. So we've got a clinical scenario, got a bitch coming in for vaccination. Somebody asks, if I have my bitch spayed, will it reduce the incidence of mammary tumours? And we split the question into something that's searchable. So we say, in healthy bitches, breed, age unspecified, does ovarectomy intervention reduce the incidence? So this is something really critical and something that's done really badly by, I think, anybody trying to do evidence-based veterinary medicine struggles, really struggles to convert an information need into something that is searchable. And I think this is a massive area where we need to put a lot of effort into people clearly understanding how you make that translation from an information need into something that's that can be searched upon. I just want to draw your attention to Vetri Evidence. It's an online open access peer-reviewed journal. It is owned by RCVS Knowledge, so it comes under them. And it's aimed at not only veterinary surgeons, but veterinary nurses and paraprofessionals. And its aim is to become a go-to resource for evidence-based veterinary medicine, is its remit. And just to give you some facts and figures behind it, it was launched in January 2016. They track hit rates from different countries, and we know people from 100 plus different countries are using it. And the hit rates on their open access material is in excess of 100,000 since their inception in 2016. And this gives you some sense of, how that journal's beginning to penetrate in terms of its monthly figures. So you can see the graph going up. So it is beginning to attract attention. And it's got over 100 publications on its database, and they do track which are the most viewed papers, of which this as a very short example. They also produce podcasts, and I think it's a really smart thing to do. They produce 3 minutes podcasts based on the papers that are published, or the summaries that are published. And it does mean that if you and I are riding in our car, we can actually listen to a summary of the summary, if you like, which means that we can make best use of our dead time. And they are getting some good feedback in the social media. It's attracting some really favourable comments, which is good to see. The nice thing for me is that they've developed this concept of creating question databases. So they are trying, using focus groups, to produce lists of important information needs in the form of a question, a PICO question, a well-phrased question that we can begin to search on. And what authors can do is actually select from some of those pre-established lists to address a real question. So authors are just doing the process. They're taking some of the questions that's come out of focus groups to do their knowledge summary on. And this is it. I mean, we've talked over, what a knowledge summary is, this short critical appraisals of the literature, and they address very, very specific clinical scenarios. This is just a brief sort of compare and contrast. Systematic reviews are the creme de la creme, if you like, of evidence-based veterinary medicine. There's a very detailed process that you go through. It looks at really all the available evidence and collates it in a very formal way. Knowledge and takes quite a long time to do. It's a very formal process. Knowledge summaries have some constraints, they have some rules, they have some processes across them, but in general terms, they are quicker, easier. But you could argue that, is the quality that comes out the other end, have you got to be more cautious across it? And the answer is yes, because it may not be a complete look at every database. And you've got to be aware that people doing knowledge summaries are trained to a point, but they may not be high-level scientists with the skills that perhaps systematic reviewers have. However, as a profession, it really is the only way we can fill this sort of knowledge gap, and close the time between publication and getting things into practice. But you have to just be slightly cautious. I think it's beholden on all of us, even when we're provided with a knowledge summary, just to take a close look at it and be comfortable that what it's telling us is as powerful as we think their bottom clinical line is telling us. It literally goes through what I said before, the 5 A's. You know, there's no difference. You ask an answerable question, you look for the best available evidence, you do a critical appraisal, you apply the results to clinical practice, or at least you make the evidence available so people, if they so wish, can use it to make or shape or change their clinical practice. And typically, these are some of the databases that our library helps authors use. So it's the big hitters, and contains a really high proportion of veterinary publications. So that's excellent. And this is what people struggle with, isn't it? This PICO, this patient intervention comparison outcome framework. And I think it's beholden upon all of us to get our heads around why we need to do this and how you change something that's information into something, or a question that you can change into something that you can search and get some useful information from. And it is all about meshing, it is all about search functions, and our library does provide help for people to get this right. So there is assistance across that space. Another big step forward for our CVS knowledge is something called In Focus, where In Focus every other month, bi-monthly, will, if you sign up for it, will give you an email or send you an email. And what they do is they look across about 100 journals. They select certain papers that they think are of high impact, and they'll get a panel of people to look at them and tease out the relevant information that we think practitioners will be able to use in a way that they can understand. And I think that is a big step forward. It looks at single studies. It's not doing a critical appraisal of a variety of studies, but I think that's a very, very useful step forward. Just to finish off with, I just want to look and broaden out evidence-based veterinary medicine a little bit. And as always, the medics tend to be ahead of us. They've now moved into sort of improvement science, looking at how you implement evidence, and looking into quality improvement. And the veterinary, our CVS knowledge is doing quite a lot to push down that quality improvement space. But I came across this really quite nice paper which provides some kind of framework to understand where evidence-based veterinary medicine is trying to feed in, how the outcomes of research feed into the top line, if you like, in terms of developing, is it effective, is it efficient? And then quality improvement. I think we've been a bit naive thinking that, if we push this information out to practitioners, it'll simply get implemented because it's the right thing to do. And we know from our sister profession that simply isn't true. We know that adoption and propagation is equally challenging as actually doing the critical appraisal itself. And what we talk about in that bigger framework is kind of efficiency, effectiveness, or efficacy, effectiveness, and efficiency. And it's all about saying, well, does it work? Can it be generalized to my population? And is it cost effective to actually implement it and do it? And it's all about appropriate adoption and quality improvement. For those not familiar with it, it's all about trying to measure how effective that translation of evidence-based veterinary medicine has been into practice. So if you look at that equation that I've put there, I've put number of patients receiving intervention over the number of patients who should have received intervention. And it can be something as simple as like, well, you should be weighing your dogs every time they come through your surgery. What proportion of dogs that actually get weighed that come through my surgery? So it's a benchmark, isn't it? It's a measure of what's being implemented in terms of what is best practice. So you can see the linkage begin to happen between evidence-based, between adoption, between quality measures, and how we can improve as a practice, not just as a knowledge base. And it's interesting to me, RCVS Knowledge, they had a skills day, and what's thrown into that space was quality improvement, patient safety, and clinical audits. And Caroline Oxby has done some great work on patient safety. And it is all bounded by evidence-based, but it's interesting to me that it's gone beyond simply this process. And now we're looking at sort of the bigger picture of implementation and how it impacts and how we can embed it in the practice structure, if you like. And these are some statements that were made by Kathleen Riegnager. Quality is about ensuring that a consistent evidence-based approach is applied to all cases. And she goes on and makes other statements as well. But you can see how it's beginning to move into this larger framework that we've borrowed from our sister profession. Now, I really like this slide. This came out of that paper in the framework. So I think evidence-based veterinary medicine is do the right thing. So evidence-based medicine can tell you that, what the right thing to do is based on current evidence. That's what it's trying to do. Quality improvement is about doing things right. And then if you combine those two, it's to do the right things right. And I think that's a really, really interesting little catchphrase that begins to put evidence-based veterinary medicine into this broader category and demonstrates how it links into quality improvement. My last word is really just to talk about practice-based evidence. It's a very brief slide, but we're moving into an era where we can begin to garner and collect quite massive databases, metadatabases. It may involve the corporates, or it may involve large research, multi-center research like Veterinary Compass. And that provides another opportunity. I mean, ultimately we think, yes, it's likely to get published, but I think there is a different level now happening, that we are beginning to develop much larger, more systematic database, and we might want to think about how we can use those to inform evidence-based veterinary medicine going forward, and how much joined up data collection that we need to do to become really, really powerful in that sort of bottom database coming from clinics rather than coming from laboratories. And I think that's a really exciting space that's going to happen. We've only got to look at some of the developments at Surrey, for instance, where we're beginning to look at data collection across individual animals wearing collars that GPS, and certainly in the cattle field, in which I work, we've already got collection of pedometry, we've already got collection of temperatures on ears of calves and all the rest of it. So we are beginning to move in a very different evidence-based data collection area that I think will be very helpful. So that's my very brief, very personal view, actually. I've touched on a variety of different things. I've moved quite quickly, and my apologies to those who are struggling a little bit. But I wanted to draw it out and say, well, how far has it moved? Are we moving into a different era where evidence-based is moving, towards quality improvement? Going forwards, how is technology and data collection going to impact? And, should we be planning now as to, how powerful that information could be if we actually set up processes and systematic approaches so we can garner the evidence that it's provided? So, Stacey, that's the end of my talk.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Peter, for your overview of evidence-based veterinary medicine. I found it very interesting, and I'm sure people watching in their practice or at home found it very useful as well. I'd also like to thank the RCVS for sponsoring this webinar too. And just before we go to questions, I'm sure most people within the webinar vet community know that I love statistics and reading your feedback. So if you could spare 30 seconds to complete the feedback survey that hopefully has popped up in a new tab in your browser, we'd be really grateful for that. But I do know from reading your feedback that depending on the device that you're using to watch the webinar, the survey doesn't always pop up. So if that's the case for you, I've also put the link into the chat box as well for you to access. And if you're listening to the webinar recording, you can add any feedback in the comments section on the website. You also may have noticed that I've added the link for the RCVS pre-congress evening on Friday the 19th of January, and the theme is finding your purpose and passion. There are 3 great speakers in that session who are going to help and provide guidance on finding your purpose and passion. So if you haven't already registered for the pre-congress evening with the RCVS, which is 2 hours of free CPD, the link for this is also in the chat box. Okay, Peter, so we haven't had any questions submitted just at the moment, but I have a question that popped into my head. I was wondering, like you said, I suspect the lack of time is often referred to as a barrier for people carrying out evidence-based veterinary medicine in practice. If people are able to find the time and are keen to get involved, are there any mentors to help people with specific projects and help them to avoid potential pitfalls?
Yeah, I mean, there is some really good support documentation. For instance, the knowledge summary provides a really detailed and very simple but detailed document that takes you through the 7 steps that we use to do or produce a knowledge summary. In addition to that, the library will provide search functions. So Claire Bolton helps a lot of our authors to put together what can be, from her perspective, quite simple, but from an author's perspective, can be quite a complicated meshing of different terms to make sure that we get the searches right. So that is provided free, and the access to the journals is provided free through those databases. And then there's editors that work below me as chief editor, and we're always happy to provide authors with help if they've got questions while they're trying to develop their questions. We are more than happy, and this is the critical point, when people are devising, as it were, the opening question or the peak. I'm very keen that they check in with us, that we make sure we get that question properly framed, that actually enables us to do a powerful search to enable the evidence to be found if it's there. And I think it's that first step that I'll always encourage new authors to check in with us, and we'll give you every help to make sure that question's right. And then make sure that you've looked critically or carefully at the handbook, and then make sure that you use our librarian to get those search functions correctly devised. And then we will help you through the system, because it will go to reviewers, and we will help you reshape your paper if there are problems across it. So there is support in place.
Yeah, that sounds amazing, because I was wondering as well, you know, it could be a confidence thing if people aren't really sure, but knowing that there's help out there, you know, could help people be more keen to get involved.
I think so, and it's a really good use of time. You know, if you know, every practitioner out there did one knowledge summary, you look at the database that could be developed. It's enormous. In the same way, you know, if you look at across the number of vet students we've got in our vet schools now, you know, it'd be fantastic if they each did, you know, one knowledge summary as part of their final year under supervision, and you can imagine how quickly that archive of information would grow. Be aware, though, that this stuff goes out of date. You know, as a new study comes on stream, you've got to be careful. That could completely replace or completely transform a pre-existing knowledge summary. So it's absolutely critical that we timestamp them and we do update them, because knowledge changes rapidly. Yes.
I also agree that this is vital. So, yeah, constantly need to keep up to date on these things. There's also been, not a question, but a comment about an RCVS resource, which unfortunately I can't cut and paste into the chat box, but it might be another resource that people are interested in having a look at. And the website is www.ebvmlearning.org.
Yeah.
So just a comment there from Zoe, who wanted to share that information as well.
Within that site, there is an excellent training program across evidence-based veterinary medicine, takes you through the 5 A's. And I've been through it, and we do set that for our students to do. as well. So I know that particular program very well, and I'd recommend anybody who wants to break the ice across it to start there.
Brilliant, that's absolutely fantastic. So there haven't been any more questions submitted, so thank you again to Peter for your time today and your brilliant webinar, and the RCVS for kindly sponsoring this webinar. Thank you to everyone who joined us on the live webinar today. It's always great to have your company and for providing feedback. And last but not least, thank you to Stuart for co-hosting with me on the webinar today. And I hope you can join us on another webinar soon. Perhaps the RCVS pre-Congress evening in January, as I mentioned, on the 19th of January.